Okay, ladies, gentlemen, and everyone, today we're going to look at the fourth and final theme in the American West. It is conflict and tension. Quite a big one, but simple to understand, I hope. Let's jump in. We're going to look at conflict and tension. We're going to look at how things change for the Indians, their way of life, and we're going to look at the destruction of the Indians' way of life. Once again, just a reminder what we're looking at, the Great Plains right there in the middle. That is the area that is causing the tension. Big picture. Early government policy, 1830 to 51. In the 1830s, the American government respected Indian lands. They took efforts to keep whites and Indians apart. Some people saw the natives as savages who needed to be civilized or removed as they were in the way of manifest destiny. Government policy began to change as migration west began to increase, leading to conflict and tension. So 1830, we've got the Indian Removal Act. We've got the Permanent Indian Frontier of 1834. We've got increased migration in the 40s, and we've got the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851. You may well get a narrative that you have to answer talking about these early days. So let's look at them a bit more closely. So, Indian Removal Act. In 1830, it was passed. It forced 46,000 Cherokee Indians to move from the east to Indian Territory on the plains. Thousands died on the journey, the Trail of Tears. Then in 1834, they set up the Permanent Indian Frontier. This was a border to split white and Indian territory. Whites have the east, Indians have to have the west. Increased migration in the 40s. As US territory began to grow in the 40s, Oregon became American, Texas and California were taken from Mexico after they beat them in a war. The government now began to openly encourage whites to cross Indian lands to settle. This begins to cause conflict with Indians over buffalo and land. The Americans want people in those territories so they can be properly American and complete manifest destiny. Fort Laramie Treaty, 1851. The government, to change its policy, which aims to bring more control over the Indians, it agrees the Fort Laramie Treaty, 1851, to reduce conflict on the plains and passes the Indian Appropriations Act to set up the first reservations. So what happens here is really important if you ever get given a question on the reservations. 1851, the first reservations are set up, simply moving the Indians away from the tracts and the areas that the white people want to go through. It's the start of things. These reservations would get smaller and smaller and there'd be more control. Fort Laramie, the first main agreement between the Plains Indians and the US government. It aimed at solving the increasing conflict between settlers and the Native Americans. It eventually failed. What caused the treaty? So why did they want it? Increased migration across the plains due to the Oregon Trail and the gold rush. Whites were hunting buffalo, which impacted on Indian survival. Indians were angry at the whites crossing their territory. The white settlers were attacked by angry Indians. White settlers pressure the government to do something about it, which leads to the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851. Fort Laramie Treaty, what was agreed? The Indians agreed to allow white settlers to travel safely through their territory, to allow the building of roads, army posts, and eventually the transcontinental railroad through Indian territory. This was a terrible decision because it would lead to their end. Each Indian tribe would have their own territory. It would be theirs forever, and whites would not settle on it. The Sioux were given the Black Hills in Dakota, and they had to pay compensation if they broke the agreements by attacking white settlers. The American government agreed to protect Indians from white Americans crossing the plains, to provide the tribes with supplies of food, clothing, and $50,000 a year. This would be taken away if the treaty was broken by the Indians. It was to stop whites from trying to settle on Indian territory. Bear in mind, by giving them money and supplies, they are starting to make the Indians reliant on the whites, which would help to control them later. Results of Fort Laramie, well, they didn't really know what they were signing, the Indians. They had no idea what territory was. They didn't speak English, so they didn't understand what was being told to them. Sometimes they didn't send chiefs to the meeting, they sent other members of the tribe. Of course, the chief couldn't speak for the whole tribe, so just because they agreed the settlement at Laramie didn't mean everybody else had to stick to it. But you can see by the map what's happened. Lots of army forts full of soldiers all over the place, which would help to control the Indians. How significant was Laramie? Territories were set out for the Plains Indians, so they can't just drift around anymore, they're told where they've got to be. White settlers were allowed into Indian territory. Roads, railroads, and military bases were set up in Indian territories. Tribes received resources from the government. It led to reservations, migration for the whites, control, and reliance. They relied on the whites. Leads to the loss of Indian way of life and more conflict. Consequences of Fort Laramie could well be a question. Consequence 1, it led to more white control over the Indians by placing tribes in agreed territory. The Sioux were given the Black Hills. It sped up the eventual moving of Indians to reservations and their loss of land. Indians became dependent on supplies, and the $50,000 a year was used as a tool to control the Indians. Some tribes, like Little Crow's Sioux, were not given their supplies, which led to starvation and caused a war. Second consequence, the treaty simply increased white migration west, with thousands more crossing the Oregon Trail because they could do so with guaranteed safety now. It also led to the Transcontinental Railroad being built, which the Indians agreed could cut across the plains. This cut through Indian lands and devastated the buffalo. It was also fenced off, so the buffalo couldn't cross. White settlers broke the treaty by settling on Indian lands. Miners used the Bozeman Trail crossing Indian land, which caused Red Cloud's War in 1866. Big Picture Appropriations Act. It set up the first reservations on the Great Plains. Government begins to move Indians to specific territory called reservations so they can take their homeland for white settlement. These are huge areas of land under white rule where Indians are encouraged to civilize, farm, give up their traditional homeland. These reservations control, confine, and civilize Native Americans. Little Crow's Sioux traded 25 million acres for 1.4 million in 1851, so they were losing their land. As the development of the West increased, the impact on the traditional Indian way of life grew. Gold rushes. In the 1849 gold rush in California, prospectors killed Indians and took their land. The Bozeman Trail to the gold cut through Sioux lands, breaking the terms of Laramie. It led to Red Cloud's War. The Homestead Act directly led to settlement on the Great Plains in states like Nebraska and Kansas, which led to conflict with new settlers over land and resources. These new settlements brought white culture, churches, schools, and stores, which were opposite to Indian culture. The cattle industry, the growth of the open range ranches impacted buffalo grazing areas, helping buffalo numbers to decline. As cattle trails crossed Indian lands, some Indians attacked cowboys. Even Loving was killed. The railroad. The railroad led to huge settlement on the Great Plains across Indian territory. Tribes like the Pawnee tribe were moved to a reservation. The railroad impacted on the buffalo as it cut through their migration routes. Buffalo Bill, the hunter, he killed 4,280 buffalo in a year. So they're going to have nothing left to eat or to make things from. Conflict on the plains, plains wars. The causes of these conflicts were the constant breaking of the Fort Laramie Treaty, white promises, and the Indian frustration at reservations and the decline of their traditional way of life. There are 3 wars in this period which lead to another agreement between natives and whites, the Second Fort Laramie Treaty. You may get a narrative of this overview. Little Crow's War, 1862, Black Kettle's War, 1864, Red Cloud's War, 1868, and the Second Fort Laramie Treaty in 1868. Let's look at these more closely. Firstly, Little Crow's War. The First Plains War is led by Little Crow of the Santee Sioux. Little Crow's Sioux were unhappy at their reservation. They had poor land, and the whites breaking promises by not giving them their supplies. So they attacked the reservation and settlements. They killed 600 white settlers and went to war. Little Crow and 300 men executed. Survivors moved to a smaller reservation where they struggled to survive. Black Kettle's War. The Second Plains War follows with similar causes to Little Crow's. Black Kettle agrees the Fort Wise Treaty to move his Cheyenne tribe to reservations, but his Dog soldiers refuse and they go to war. Whilst on the reservations, the Cheyenne struggle, so they attack white settlements for food to survive. Cheyenne mistakenly attacked by Colonel Chivington, causing the Sand Creek Massacre of 130 innocent lives. Black Kettle escapes and the whites go unpunished. So once they leave their reservation, the army decides to attack them. Colonel Chivington attacks at Sand Creek, but he massacres not just soldiers, but women and children too. Red Cloud's War. The final war is caused by the open breaking of the Laramie Treaty. Red Cloud was angry at the miners for breaking the Fort Laramie Treaty. They crossed his land using the Bozeman Trail, illegal trail. The Sioux, led by Red Cloud and Crazy Horse, go to war. They attack miners, US Army settlements, and block the Bozeman Trail. They commit the Fetterman massacre of 150 soldiers, causing the US to admit defeat and sign the Second Fort Laramie Treaty. It's called Fetterman's Trap, where William Fetterman and his men spotted a scout because the scout wanted him to spot them, led them into a trap and massacred them. Second Fort Laramie Treaty, 1868. The government agrees this after their defeat by Red Cloud. Red Cloud agrees to move his tribe to the Great Sioux Reservation in Dakota, which includes their sacred Black Hills, which the whites agree not to settle or mine on. However, Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull refuse to move on to the reservation. They stay out, setting up a later conflict, Little Bighorn. You see, what Custer was sent to do was to get them back onto the reservation. Government agrees to close the Bozeman Trail and all US Army forts on Indian lands. They order that any Sioux who refuse to go to reservations will be hunted down and killed, comply or die. So they have to go onto reservations or they will be killed. Destruction of the Indians' way of life. From 1876 onwards, the traditional Indian way of life is completely destroyed by the whites. The government seeks to actively destroy the nomadic way of life. From 1876, the policy of assimilate or die was used to force all natives onto reservations while they destroyed the buffalo. Assimilate means become like the whites, live in houses and farm and live in families. Eventually, the government sought to take the last pieces of Indian territory, leading to the Ghost Dance and the Wounded Knee Massacre. By 1890, the traditional Indian way of life has been ruined. So you may get a narrative about this destruction of Indians' way of life. We've got the Battle of the Little Bighorn, buffalo destruction, the Dawes Act, which is like a Homestead Act for Indians, and then the Ghost Dance and Wounded Knee. And this finishes it off. Let's look at it more closely. The Great Sioux War and Little Bighorn. The Battle of the Little Bighorn in 1876 was a turning point in White and Plains Indian relations and government policy. Despite their victory, it led to their eventual demise and the start of the destruction of the Indian life. Discovery of gold. Custer, General George Armstrong Custer, prospected for gold in the Black Hills. Illegal, by the way. He reported that there was gold from the grassroots down. Miners flooded in, breaking the Second Fort Laramie Treaty, which said no mining on Sioux territory. The government offered to buy the Black Hills for $6 million. The Sioux were insulted. It's their holy place. They rejected it. It led to Crazy Horse and thousands of Sioux leaving the Great Sioux Reservation in protest and going to war against the whites. It's war. The government sent a large force led by Custer to track down the 2,000 Sioux who had camped at the Little Bighorn River. They were to return to the reservation or be killed. Custer foolishly splits his 600 men. He does not wait for the thousands of reinforcements that are on their way. He's subsequently defeated by Crazy Horse's Sioux. Custer himself is killed and his body mutilated, along with 200 men around him. The Battle of the Little Bighorn ends in a defeat for the army. It's the greatest victory for the Indians, but it's also their greatest defeat because now, well, you can see from this slide, they are going to exterminate them. It's time to quit this Sunday school policy. Let Sheridan, the chief of the army, exterminate every Indian who will not remain on the reservation. So they're told, go on the reservations or you will be killed. Consequences of Little Bighorn. This could be a question as well, the consequences. Increased white control. Changing white attitudes, the public and the government were now keen to crush any Indian resistance, assimilate or die. Loss of their leaders, all warriors were hunted down. Sioux leader Crazy Horse was killed and Sitting Bull was captured. White domination, all Sioux weapons and horses were taken away, whilst 2 new forts were built on the plains, with 2,500 soldiers to keep the peace. A decline of the Indian way of life. Almost all Sioux and Cheyenne forced onto reservation. The Sioux were forced to give up the Black Hills or the government would stop sending them food. The Indians became dependent on the government for food and shelter. They couldn't hunt the buffalo anymore and they struggled to farm. So they have total control. There's your 2 consequences of Bighorn. Reservations set up by the government in 1851, Indian Appropriations Act. All Indians were forced into them by 1885. It was part of Assimilate or Die after Little Bighorn. Confined. Indians lost their traditional homelands. They were forced onto smaller, poor lands. Little Crow and the Great Sioux Reservation, they lost the Black Hills. Lands were not close to hunting grounds. They couldn't leave to hunt or they'd be chased by the army. It ended their nomadic lifestyle. Civilized. Churches were set up to convert them to Christianity. Tribal ceremonies like the buffalo dance were banned. Boarding schools were set up to kill the Indian and save the man, with 2,020 kids by 1887. They were taught white ways. Read and write, Christianity. Natives forced to farm, which they couldn't. Many died. It led to alcoholism and depression because they'd lost their lifestyle. And control. The Bureau of Indian Affairs ran the reservation agency who controlled food and supplies. They would often cheat Indians out of their food. This also removed power of the Indian chiefs over their tribes. The government hired natives to police their own people. All weapons and horses were taken. So they've got a police force now that will patrol the reservations, and chiefs have no part. Tribes have no part because they're being forced to live as families. Destruction of the buffalo. Only 200 remained out of 25 million by 1885. A combination of factors causes the destruction. Hunters, the leather industry, the cattle industry. Historians call the extermination of the buffalo a decision made purposely by the government. Government policy. They wanted to force Indians onto reservations. By destroying their main source of food, Indians wouldn't be able to go and hunt, and they would have to farm. This would make them less independent, more reliant on the US government, giving them more control. Impact on natives. The loss of buffalo completely ended the Indian nomadic lifestyle. They were unable to hunt to provide the essential food and items they needed to survive. It impacted their beliefs as they were unable to complete the ceremonial buffalo dance and hunt. The Dawes Act. Now, this is basically a homestead act for Indians. The government wants to end reservations, split up tribes, force them to be civilized, and free up more land for whites. The Dawes Act split up all remaining Indian territory into 160 acres per Indian family. Any unclaimed land was available to be sold to the whites, just like the Homestead Act. By 1890, consequences, a good question, consequence of the Dawes Act. By 1890, the Indians lost 50% of the lands they had. Those who accepted and moved onto the land, they struggled as the land was poor. Many Indians starved. Most Indians sold their land to whites, leaving them with nothing. Others were cheated out of their land or just didn't take it in the first place because they didn't want to farm. In 1890, the US government even closed the permanent Indian frontier, highlighting they'd achieved manifest destiny. There was no longer any Indian territory, it was all white. The ghost dance. By the 90s, Indians were facing an increasingly bad situation with the growing destruction of their way of life. One Indian response to the situation was the ghost dance. Sioux Indian Vivoka starts the ghost dance. He stated that if Indians did the dance, then whites would be washed away, the buffalo returned, and dead Indians brought back to life. The movement spread across reservations, and the US see it as rebellions, and President Harrison orders the army to stop it. This leads to the massacre at Wounded Knee in 1890. In 1890, police attempt to arrest Sitting Bull, who they believe is planning a ghost dance rebellion, but they kill him. The Sioux flee the reservation and are chased to Wounded Knee. The US tries to disarm the Indians, and some begin the ghost dance. In the confusion, the US Army opens fire, and within 10 minutes, 250 Indians and 25 US soldiers are killed. It's a massacre. This ends the ghost dance movement and any Indian resistance forever, with whites seeing it as revenge for Little Bighorn. Here are some possible questions that you could get. Obviously, underneath this, if you're looking on YouTube, there will be plenty of links to help you revise. On to the final thing then, conflict and tension. I've mentioned this in another video, but there is conflict and tension between cattle ranchers and homesteaders. The Homestead Act dramatically increased the settlement of the American West. The development of the cattle industry throughout the 60s and 70s caused a further demand for land. Consequently, there was tension and rivalry between the small family homesteaders and the powerful cattle barons. Why were the homesteaders angry with the ranchers? They bought up the land. They cheated and bought up homestead land. Greed. Homesteaders complained the wealthy cattle ranchers were buying up too much land. They accused them of taking the best land and then blocking their access to water. Homesteaders often lost court cases over the right to land as they couldn't pay the court fees, and when they got there, the rich cattle barons, they could get the best lawyers and influence the judges. Destructive cattle. Homesteaders became increasingly frustrated with free-to-roam cattle trampling and destroying their crops and damaging their buildings. They wanted ranchers to fence their land off, but they wouldn't. They wanted an open range. False accusations. Homesteaders were often accused of cattle rustling. Unproven accusations could result in ranchers destroying homestead fences or using violence. Fencing. Homesteaders accused the wealthy ranchers of buying the best land with access to timber or water, then fencing it off to block the homesteaders from using land that they'd previously used. Ranchers angry with the homesteaders. Ranchers need a lot of land for cattle or grass. They believed homesteaders were deliberately buying up plots of land to stop them expanding. They bought their land around the ranches. Right to roam. Ranchers argued the cattle had a right to roam freely on land, as this was the whole purpose of open range ranching. But ranchers argued it was the responsibility of homesteaders to fence off their land if they wanted to protect it from cattle. Disease. Lots of ranchers accused the homesteaders because they kept sheep of not doing enough to stop the spread of sheep scalp, which could kill their cattle. Some cattlemen led raids to kill hundreds of sheep. The sheep that the homesteaders had ate the same grass as the cattle, which meant that there was less food for the cattle barons' cattle. Money. Ranchers felt they had a right to the best land as their cattle business contributed lots to the US economy. Consequences of this tension, basically it leads to range wars, vigilante groups being used by both sides, a strain on the law enforcement agencies. Johnson County War. This is a good example. What I'm going to do, because I've talked about it before, I'm going to ask you just to pause this if you want to look at it and learn it that way. Same with this. I'm going to ask you to pause it when you want to and learn it this way. It's probably a good narrative, the narrative of the Johnson County War. Consequences and importance. These could be questions, couldn't they? You could be asked for a consequence of the Johnson County War, or why was the Johnson County War important? Okay, that is it. So good luck with that one. Don't forget, look at the resources and things that you have at the